step with me beyond the grand marble facades of an empire that gave the world laws and legions, and into the shadowed corridors where its true currency was traded. This currency wasn't gold or silver, but flesh and power. We are about to journey into a Rome where sex was rarely about intimacy, but was instead a meticulously crafted tool for domination, a spectacle of control, and a brutal instrument of torture. The scenes that will unfold are not the product of a fevered imagination or some lurid fantasy. They are the stark realities of history, truths that were so commonplace they were carved into public walls, painted onto the dinner plates of the elite, and recorded without shame in official documents. Tonight, we peel back the veneer of glory to witness the most naked truths the Roman Empire left buried in the dust, revealing a world where the body was just another battlefield. To understand ancient Rome, we must first discard our modern notions of sex as a private, emotional affair. In the Roman world, intimacy was a foreign concept. Every sexual act was a public declaration of status, a brutal calculus of power that everyone was expected to understand. It was a language spoken not in whispers but in actions, and its grammar was simple and unforgiving. There was the one who penetrated and the one who was penetrated. This single dynamic was the ultimate measure of a man's standing in the social hierarchy. It communicated everything about his authority, his masculinity, and his right to command. Sex was never a union of equals. It was a transaction where pleasure was incidental to the raw assertion of dominance. The architecture of Roman dominance was built from the ground up, beginning within the walls of the family home. At the heart of every household stood the paterfamilias, the eldest male, who wielded an almost absolute power known as patria potestas over his entire lineage. This authority wasn't merely symbolic, it was a legal right that, in the early republic, included the chilling veter necisque potestas, the power of life and death. His wife, his sons and their families, his unmarried daughters, and every slave he owned was subject to his will. The Roman household was not a sanctuary of affection, but a miniature kingdom, and the paterfamilias was its unquestioned and often unforgiving monarch, whose command was law. The absolute control of the paterfamilias was terrifyingly concrete, establishing the first and most profound lesson in Roman hierarchy. This was a world where a father legally held the right to sell his own children into slavery, to reject a newborn infant by simply refusing to pick it up, or to force his daughter into a marriage that would benefit him politically or financially. While the act of executing a child became rarer over time, the legal authority remained a potent symbol of his ultimate power. This domestic tyranny was the bedrock of Roman society, teaching every citizen from birth that power was absolute, submission was natural, and the family unit itself was the first stage for demonstrating unquestionable control. For the elite men who governed Rome, the authority they wielded within their homes was indivisible from the power they exercised in the Senate or on the battlefield. Sexual dominance was not a separate, private pursuit. It was a seamless extension of their public and political control. The right to command legions was ideologically identical to the right to command the bodies of their social inferiors, be they slaves, conquered peoples, or even lower-class citizens. They could take what they wanted, and the bodies of others were simply another resource to be exploited without moral hesitation. The bedroom was just another province to be conquered and governed, a private reflection of the very public power they held over the world. In the Roman mind, the ethical framework for a sexual act was not built on the modern pillar of consent, which was an entirely alien concept when dealing with anyone of a lower status. The morality of an encounter hinged on a single, crucial question: did the freeborn Roman male maintain his position of dominance? The violence of the act or the desires of the other person were irrelevant details. Manhood was defined not through mutual agreement but through conquest. As long as he was the active, penetrating force, his honor remained intact. This twisted logic transformed sexual encounters into a constant performance of power. where the submission of another body served only to validate his own superior standing in the world. In this rigidly defined world of sexual politics, the most profound terror a Roman man could face was the accusation of enjoying the passive role. This fear was not about sexual preference. It was about being publicly stripped of one's masculinity and, by extension, one's fitness to hold power. To be labelled as someone who willingly submitted was to be seen as effeminate, weak, and fundamentally un-Roman. A well-placed rumour suggesting a senator enjoyed being penetrated could be a more lethal political weapon than any dagger. It could instantly shatter a lifetime's reputation, turning a respected general or statesman into a walking punchline, an object of mockery and scorn from which there was no recovery. Because a man's sexual conduct was so intricately tied to his public standing, there was truly no such thing as a private life in Rome. Every encounter was a performance, and the entire city was the audience. Gossip was not idle chatter. It was a potent force that could build or destroy reputations. Rivals would employ spies to witness compromising behavior, and libelous graffiti would mysteriously appear on public walls, broadcasting accusations to the entire populace. A man's worth could be debated and dismantled based on who he was seen with at a banquet, or what a disgruntled slave whispered about his activities behind closed doors. The risk of exposure was constant, creating a society of perpetual surveillance where every citizen was both an actor and a judge. Living under the weight of such relentless scrutiny, Roman men became obsessed with projecting an image of absolute self-control. This went far beyond simple discipline. It was a deep-seated psychological need to perform masculinity at every waking moment. They meticulously managed their posture, their facial expressions, and even the timbre of their voice to convey unwavering certainty. Any hint of softness, any moment of hesitation, could be misconstrued as weakness, the most unforgivable sin in the Roman ethos. This constant, exhausting performance of an ironclad persona was not just about social grace. In a world where perception was reality, it was a fundamental strategy for survival. Far from being a private retreat from the pressures of the world, the Roman home was yet another theatre for the performance of power. The elite man did not return to his villa for sanctuary, but to preside over his personal empire. He surrounded himself with a carefully curated collection of subordinates, an obedient wife, submissive children, and a host of slaves whose bodies he could command at will. The very architecture of the home, with its public reception areas and private quarters, was designed to display his hierarchical control. Every interaction within these walls, from a shared meal to a sexual command, was a reinforcement of his status, a public demonstration for guests, rivals, and history itself that he was, above all else, a master. In the rigid economy of Roman power, a woman's body was never her own asset. Her sexuality was treated as a reflection of the status and honor of her male guardian, first her father, then her husband. She was the vessel of the family's reputation, and her virtue was his responsibility. If a woman was rumored to be promiscuous or unfaithful, it was not merely her name that was tarnished, it was his honor that was questioned in the public square. People would whisper that he had lost his grip, that he was incapable of controlling his own property. Her misbehavior was seen as his failure, a public announcement of his inability to dominate what rightfully belonged to him. This crushing double standard was codified into law under Emperor Augustus with the passage of the Lex Julia de Adulteris Coascendis. This legislation transformed adultery from a private family matter into a public crime, but its application was spectacularly one-sided. A married woman caught in an affair faced severe penalties. She could be exiled to a remote island, stripped of a significant portion of her dowry and property, and branded with permanent social disgrace, infamia. Her male partner, if also a citizen, faced similar consequences. A husband's infidelities, however, were almost entirely ignored by the law, as long as his partners were not the wives of other citizens. The Lex Julia contained a provision that starkly illustrated the different values placed on male and female fidelity. It granted a father the legal right to kill his own daughter and her lover if he caught them in the act of adultery within his home or his son-in-law's home. This was an extraordinary power, rooted in the idea that her transgression brought an unbearable stain upon the family's honor. A husband, by contrast, was granted a more limited right. He could only kill his wife's partner without punishment if the man was of a low social status, like a slave or an actor, and he was required to divorce his wife immediately. This legal distinction reinforced that a woman's body was property, and its violation was an offense against the men who owned it. At the absolute bottom of Rome's social pyramid were the slaves, who were not considered legal persons but were classified as property or res things. This legal definition had profound and horrific consequences for their lives. They could not legally marry, own property, or testify in court against their master. Crucially, in the context of sexuality, they had no right to bodily autonomy. The concept of a slave giving or withholding consent was a legal and social impossibility. A slave's body was simply a tool, an instrument for their owner's labor, pleasure, or wrath, no different from a piece of furniture or a farm animal in the eyes of the law. This dehumanizing legal status created a vast safety net for the sexual appetites of freeborn Roman men. While their interactions with fellow citizens were governed by complex rules of honor and reputation, the world of slavery was a lawless frontier. Any sexual act a man wanted to perform with a slave, male or female, young or old, was permissible. There was no law to stop him, no religious taboo to consider, and no social shame to fear. The institution of slavery provided a sanctioned, consequence-free outlet for any and all desires, allowing a man to maintain a public facade of virtue while engaging in unlimited exploitation in private. The Roman definition of adultery was narrowly constructed to protect the bloodlines of citizens, and it had nothing to do with emotional fidelity or universal morality. Consequently, a married man's sexual relations with a slave were never considered an act of infidelity. His loyalty to his wife was measured only by his avoidance of other respectable, freeborn women, particularly the wives of his peers. A slave simply did not count in this equation. This legal loophole was wide enough to accommodate every form of exploitation, allowing a man to maintain a household filled with sexual servants without ever technically betraying his marriage vows in the eyes of Roman society. The practice of keeping slaves for sexual purposes was not a hidden perversion of a decadent few. It was a widespread and normalized feature of Roman life across all classes that could afford it. Wealthy villas in the countryside, cramped apartments in the city, and even rugged military camps on the frontiers would have included enslaved individuals chosen specifically for their looks and designated for sexual service. Their function was an open secret, often alluded to through crude nicknames or jokes. There were no whispered scandals about these arrangements because, in the Roman mind, a master was simply making use of his property as he saw fit. Within this system, the role of the Roman wife was one of calculated ignorance and silent endurance. She was expected to preside over a household that might include her husband's favorite slave boy or a female concubine, and she was to do so without complaint. Expressing jealousy or outrage would have been seen as a breach of her duty, a failure to understand her place. Her silence was not just a matter of keeping the peace. It was considered an active form of loyalty to her husband and his patriarchal authority. Some mothers even explicitly taught their daughters how to manage their emotions and tolerate the presence of their husband's other partners as a necessary part of being a Roman wife. For a Roman man, the only real social danger in his sexual use of slaves was not the act of exploitation itself, but the risk of developing a genuine emotional attachment. To become too fond of a particular slave, to treat them with too much tenderness, or to spend excessively on them was to invite mockery from his peers. Such behavior was perceived as a loss of masculine control and a confusion of the rigid hierarchy. It suggested that the master had forgotten his dominant place and had allowed himself to be mastered by his feelings for an inferior. In Rome, it was more shameful to love a slave than it was to abuse one. This entire structure of sexual dominance was reinforced and legitimized by the highest authority of all the gods. Roman mythology was replete with stories of deities who mirrored the actions of elite men. Jupiter, the king of the gods, was famously portrayed as a serial sexual conqueror, taking goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women by force or by trickery. These powerful myths did not challenge the existing power structures on Earth, they sanctified them. They sent a clear message that boundless appetite and sexual conquest were not human flaws but divine attributes. The actions of a Roman master in his own household were merely a small echo of the cosmic dramas played out by the gods themselves. While the sexual use of slaves was a private right of the master, Rome managed public desire with a strikingly different, almost bureaucratic approach. The empire didn't simply tolerate prostitution, it meticulously organized, regulated, and, most importantly, taxed it. This wasn't a hidden, shameful secret confined to the city's dark corners. Instead, it was an officially sanctioned part of the urban machinery. Prostitutes were legally required to register with the local magistrates, the aediles, who would record their names and services in official ledgers. In doing so, Rome transformed the act of selling sex from a moral failing into a structured, taxable industry, managed with the same cold efficiency as any other civic utility. Despite this state-sanctioned legality, the life of a prostitute was permanently marred by a deep social and legal stain known as infamia. This was a profound paradox. Her labor was deemed necessary for the city's health, yet she was stripped of her own dignity. Once registered, a woman lost her standing as a respectable citizen. She could never marry a freeborn Roman, her children were denied rights of inheritance, and she could not file certain lawsuits. Even if she managed to leave the trade, the legal mark remained indelible. The state gave her a license to be used but offered no shield for her safety or future, trapping her in a world where she was both economically essential and socially invisible. Within this world of sanctioned shame, a rigid hierarchy mirrored the rest of Roman society. At the very bottom were the women who worked in dark, cramped stalls built into the arches of public buildings, known as fornices, the origin of our word fornication. Above them were those attached to larger brothels, Lupercalia, controlled by pimps or powerful owners. A select few operated as independent, high-class courtesans, women who were often educated and could choose their elite clients, amassing their own wealth and influence. From street walkers to bathhouse workers and performers hired for parties, the lines between desperate poverty, coercion, and a precarious form of choice were always brutally and intentionally blurred. The physical reality of this trade is perfectly preserved in the ruins of Pompeii's Lupercalia. These were not hidden slums but purpose-built structures, often located near the bustling forum or main city gates. The archaeological remains reveal a chillingly functional design, a series of small, windowless rooms or cella, each containing little more than a built-in stone bed where a mattress would have been placed. Most famously, the walls were adorned with explicit frescoes depicting various sexual acts, serving as a graphic and unambiguous menu of the services on offer. Graffiti scratched into the walls by clients and workers alike offers a haunting testament to the transactions that took place within, with some boasting of conquests and others lamenting prices. The clientele of these establishments was not limited to soldiers and commoners. The Roman elite were frequent visitors, often indulging in the very vulgarity they publicly condemned. Senators, generals, and wealthy merchants would visit brothels, sometimes in disguise, sometimes proudly. Even more extravagant were the private banquets where groups of prostitutes were hired as entertainment. These were not quiet affairs, but elaborate spectacles featuring dancers, musicians, and staged sex acts. In the competitive world of the Roman aristocracy, hosting an outrageous party and displaying one's access to a variety of bodies was a potent symbol of immense wealth and sophisticated power. If prostitution was sex turned into policy, then the festival of Lupercalia was sex turned into religion. Every year, in the middle of February, Rome would cast off its carefully constructed mantle of order and descend into a primal, chaotic ritual. The event began in the Lupercal cave, the mythical spot where the city's founders, Romulus and Remus, were suckled by a she-wolf. Their priests, known as the Luperci, clad only in goat skins or completely naked, would sacrifice goats and a dog. The air would fill with the scent of blood and wine as they prepared for the main event, a wild, frenzied run through the city streets that honored Rome's savage origins. After the sacrifice, the priests would cut the bloody goat hides into thin strips called febra, and the true spectacle would begin. They would race from the cave and through the Palatine Hill, lashing out at any woman they encountered. Far from fleeing in terror, women of all classes, including the high-born, would willingly line the streets, offering their hands and backs to be struck. In the Roman mind, this bizarre and violent act was a sacred blessing, a powerful charm believed to guarantee fertility and ease the pains of childbirth. It was a day where religious devotion was expressed not through prayer, but through a joyful, public whipping. Lupercalia endured for centuries because it served a crucial function in a society obsessed with discipline and control. It was a cultural pressure valve, a single, sanctioned day of madness that allowed the populace to indulge in impulses that were normally suppressed. The rules of modesty and social hierarchy were temporarily suspended. A senator could be seen drunkenly chasing a stranger, and it would become a funny story, not a career-ending scandal. The Romans seemed to understand that one day of sanctioned chaos helped to preserve 12 months of rigid order. It was a necessary embrace of their wild past to secure their civilized present. This ancient tradition, rooted in the very founding of Rome, finally met its end as the empire's values shifted under the influence of Christianity. By the late 5th century, church leaders condemned the festival as a lewd and heretical spectacle. Pope Gelasius I famously denounced the practice as indecent and unfit for a Christian city, arguing that its nakedness and sexual energy were a danger to public morality. Although some Romans clung to the tradition, the tide had turned. A ritual that had lasted for over 1,000 years ended not with a riot, but with a papal decree. Its wild energy folded into the tamer, more familiar customs of what some believe evolved into Valentine's Day. Even as public festivals like Lupercalia were suppressed, its spirit of excess never fully departed from Roman culture. It simply moved indoors, into the private villas of the ruling class. The elite Roman banquet was the new stage for indulgence. These gatherings would begin with fine food and philosophical debate, but often ended in collective sexual acts that were less about mutual pleasure and more about the host's power. Slaves and prostitutes were not guests but part of the catering, passed between attendees as a display of the host's wealth. These were not orgies in the modern sense of shared abandon. They were carefully choreographed spectacles where the hierarchy was always brutally intact. To walk through the preserved ruins of a Roman city like Pompeii or Herculaneum is to realize that eroticism was not confined to brothels or festivals. It was woven into the very fabric of daily life. You didn't need to seek out desire. It was displayed on the walls around you. Bedrooms were adorned with detailed frescoes depicting couples in a variety of positions. Hallways featured mythical group sex scenes, and even public spaces like bakeries and taverns had carvings of enormous phalluses. This was not considered scandalous or obscene. To the Romans, it was simply art, a constant and cheerful reminder that virility and pleasure were central, celebrated aspects of their world. The phallus was an especially sacred and ubiquitous image, known as the fashionum. It was far more than mere decoration. It was a powerful apotropaic symbol, believed to possess magical properties that could ward off the evil eye and bring good fortune. Romans placed these images everywhere, carved in relief above the doorways of their homes, in the children's rooms for protection, and even worn as amulets around their necks. Some were depicted with wings, legs, or eyes, emphasizing their active, magical agency. The message was clear and unapologetic: male sexual power wasn't a source of shame but a holy, protective force. Just like every other aspect of Roman life, their erotic art was a mirror reflecting the society's obsession with hierarchy. The scenes depicted were rarely unions of equals. The dominant, active partner, almost always a well-built, freeborn male, was idealized, his body rendered with strength and confidence. The passive or penetrated partner, by contrast, was often stylized to appear lower in status: smaller, younger, a foreigner, a slave, or a woman. Even in what should be moments of intimacy, the art reinforced the fundamental Roman belief that some people were meant to command and others were meant to submit. When these stunningly explicit artworks were unearthed by excavators in the 18th and 19th centuries, they sent a shockwave through the comparatively prudish societies of modern Europe. This was not the noble, stoic Rome they had imagined. Scandalized museum authorities quickly hid many of the most graphic frescoes and artifacts away from public view. The famous Gabinetto Segreto, or secret cabinet, was established in the Naples National Archaeological Museum to house these obscene pieces, where they remained locked away for generations, accessible only to a handful of vetted scholars, concealing the frank reality of Roman sexual openness. The Roman appetite for engineered pleasure was not limited to art, it extended to tangible tools. Archaeologists have unearthed dildos, known in some Greek texts as olisboi, in the ruins of villas and bathhouses, stored as casually as any other household item. They were crafted from wood, bronze, or covered in leather, varying in size and shape. A particularly remarkable discovery is the Vindolanda phallus, a 2nd century AD wooden object found near Hadrian's Wall in Britain. Initially catalogued as a darning tool, recent analysis suggests it was a well-used sex toy, a stunning testament to the fact that these instruments were a part of life, even on the most remote frontiers of the empire. The Romans believed that desire was not just an emotion to be felt but a force to be manipulated, and they had a whole pharmacopoeia for the task. Aphrodisiacs and love potions were a common feature of life, sold by vendors in the bustling city markets. The ingredient ranged from recognizable herbs like rocket and satyrion to more bizarre and unsettling elements. Dried goat testicles would be ground into a fine powder and stirred into wine, while bat blood was a prized ingredient in potions meant to bind a lover's will. These concoctions were not the stuff of fringe witchcraft, they were a mainstream, if sometimes discreet, part of the Roman pursuit of love and lust. The sheer variety and strangeness of these substances is catalogued in the encyclopedic work Natural History by the 1st century author Pliny the Elder. In his text, which covers everything from astronomy to botany, Pliny lists numerous supposed aphrodisiacs with clinical detachment. He describes the alleged properties of everything from skink lizards and wild boar bile to specific types of seafood and pungent herbs. His work reveals a culture that, lacking scientific understanding, turned to the natural world with a mixture of hope and superstition, convinced that the right ingredient could inflame passion, guarantee fertility, or conquer a reluctant heart. The Roman commitment to practical pleasure extended even to the design of their furniture. This was a culture that saw no reason why its household objects shouldn't accommodate sexual activity. Literary sources and archaeological finds suggest the existence of specialized furniture, such as chairs constructed with unusual angles and hand grips to support various sexual positions. In brothels, beds were often stone platforms with mattresses on top, sometimes including shallow basins underneath them to make cleaning more efficient. Even the elegant couches where guests reclined during a feast were understood to be multi-purpose, easily repurposed when the night turned physical. Further evidence of Rome's experimental and control-oriented sexuality comes from finds of leather straps and bronze buckles, occasionally found attached to bedposts or walls. While their exact use is debated, scholars believe they were likely used for sexual restraint, not as a form of punishment, but as a tool of stimulation. For the Romans, physical control over another person's body was the ultimate mark of authority. The act of binding a partner, a dynamic most often played out between a master and a slave, was a powerful physical manifestation of the dominance that permeated every aspect of their identity. The open existence and everyday use of these varied tools, from dildos and scented oils to specialized furniture and restraints, tells us something profound about the Roman character. Their presence in the historical and archaeological record is not evidence of a uniquely depraved culture, but rather of a deeply pragmatic one. The Romans approached sexual desire much as they approached any other challenge of life, like building an aqueduct or training a legion. It was a natural force to be understood, managed, refined, and, when necessary, engineered with the most effective instruments available. Even the most powerful man in Rome, Julius Caesar, was haunted by a sexual scandal that became a whisper that never stopped echoing through his career. The accusation stemmed from his youth, when as a young envoy, he spent time at the court of King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia. His political enemies, for the rest of his life, would spread the vicious rumor that he had served as the king's passive, receptive lover. This charge, which Caesar furiously denied, was the perfect weapon. It struck at the very heart of his Roman identity, suggesting he had willingly surrendered his masculine dominance. His rivals didn't need proof. The insinuation alone was enough to stain his reputation and question his fitness to command. The reign of Emperor Caligula saw the imperial palace itself transformed from a seat of government into a grand stage for perversion. The historian Suetonius paints a chilling portrait of a ruler who systematically demolished every moral boundary with sadistic glee. He was accused of committing incest with all three of his sisters, showing a particular obsession with his favorite, Drusilla. Not content with private corruption, Caligula allegedly forced the wives of high-ranking senators to participate in public sex shows for his entertainment, and even established a full-fledged brothel within the palace walls. His reign was a terrifying spectacle where absolute power manifested as an insatiable appetite for degradation. Emperor Nero's contempt for Roman tradition was most flamboyantly displayed in his two infamous marriages. In one, he became obsessed with a young boy named Sporus, who bore a striking resemblance to his deceased wife, Poppaea. In a grotesque act of possession, Nero had the boy castrated, dressed him in the regalia of an empress, and then married him in a public ceremony, calling Sporus his wife. In an even more shocking reversal of Roman norms, Nero himself played the role of the bride in a separate ceremony with one of his freedmen, Pythagoras. By publicly taking both the dominant and submissive roles, Nero wasn't just breaking the rules, he was gleefully burning the rule book. Beyond his public spectacles, the darkest stain on Nero's reputation was the persistent rumor of an incestuous relationship with his own mother, Agrippina the Younger. Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius recorded the whispers that their unnaturally close and controlling bond had crossed the ultimate line. Whether fact or politically motivated slander, the story was believed because it fit the narrative of Nero's total corruption. Incest was the final taboo, and the image of the emperor in a sexual embrace with his mother became the ultimate symbol of a power that was so absolute it had become pathologically twisted, devouring the very family and traditions it was meant to uphold. In the 3rd century AD, Rome was confronted with a ruler who shattered its concepts of gender and sexuality so completely that he remains a figure of shocked fascination. The Syrian-born emperor Elagabalus arrived in Rome not as a general but as a priest of a sun god. He immediately scandalized the city by openly living as a woman, wearing makeup, wigs, and silk gowns. The historian Cassius Dio records that he married a male charioteer named Heracles, whom he called his husband, and that he famously prostituted himself from the rooms of the imperial palace. Most remarkably, Elagabalus reportedly sought out physicians, offering them vast sums to perform what would have amounted to sex reassignment surgery, a desire so far beyond Roman comprehension that it cemented his legacy as the most sexually unconventional emperor of all. Among the Roman elite, one of the most telling symbols of extreme wealth and status was the practice of keeping beautiful young boys known as delicia, or delights. These were not adopted sons or servants in the traditional sense. They were living, breathing ornaments, collected with the same discerning eye one might use for a fine statue or an exotic bird. Sourced from slave markets or conquered lands, these boys were meticulously groomed, their hair curled, their skin softened, and trained to be pleasing and silent. They would accompany their masters to banquets, not to serve, but to be displayed, their presence an unspoken, but universally understood testament to the owner's power and refined taste for indulgence. The concept of a protected, innocent childhood, so central to modern thought, was a luxury that simply did not exist for the enslaved children of Rome. They were, from birth or capture, property, and the law offered them no special protection on account of their age. A child in a Roman household could be tasked with cleaning floors one moment and expected to provide sexual services the next. Their youth and vulnerability were not seen as reasons for restraint. On the contrary, these qualities often made them more desirable to their owners, as they were less likely to resist and easier to control. The Roman household for them was not a home, but a place of profound and constant danger. The brutal logic of the slave market extended into the darkest corners of Roman society, including organized child prostitution. Young girls, sometimes well before puberty, could be purchased by brothel owners and forced into the trade. The grim records and graffiti from the time suggest a disturbing fascination with youth, with customers often willing to pay a premium for girls who were advertised as untouched or virginal. These children were given no choice. Their bodies were simply another commodity in a system where their suffering was ignored, and the state's only interest was in collecting its share of the profits through taxes on the brothel's earnings. The intense anxiety Roman men felt about controlling female sexuality and ensuring the legitimacy of their heirs created a market for a unique and tragic class of servant, the eunuch. Boys, often from conquered territories, were subjected to castration before being trained for domestic service. In the Roman mind, this brutal mutilation improved them, creating a perfect compromise for guarding the women's quarters. A eunuch was seen as neither fully man nor woman, and could therefore attend to a noble lady in her most intimate moments, in her bath, in her bedroom, without posing a sexual threat to the family bloodline or her husband's honor. Beyond their role as safe, domestic servants, the altered bodies of eunuchs made them desirable objects of pleasure in the more decadent corners of Roman society. Their lack of traditional masculinity and their inability to procreate made them ideal sexual partners for both powerful men and women who wished to indulge without consequence. For a man, sleeping with a eunuch allowed him to engage in a same-sex act while avoiding the social shame of being with a complete man. Their bodies were violently reshaped not for their own sake, but to fit the highly specific and often perverse desires of the masters who owned them, making them the ultimate product of Roman sexual engineering. In the complex landscape of Roman sexuality, same-sex relations between men were a common and socially accepted reality, but they were governed by one ironclad rule hierarchy. The morality of the act was never about gender or love. It was exclusively about status and power. A freeborn Roman citizen could engage in sexual activity with other males without any damage to his reputation, so long as he maintained the dominant, penetrative role. This framework made sexual freedom a privilege of the elite, allowing powerful men to use younger, lower-status males, slaves, prostitutes, foreigners, as outlets for their desire, reinforcing their own masculinity in the process. While it's tempting to group all ancient attitudes together, the Roman approach to same-sex relations was fundamentally different from the Greek model of pederasty. In Greece, the relationship between an older man and an adolescent boy, at least in its philosophical ideal, contained an element of mentorship, education, and civic training. The Roman equivalent was stripped of any such noble pretense. It was a raw, and often brutal, transaction of power, most commonly played out between a master and his slave. There was no illusion of reciprocity or intellectual uplift. There was only the assertion of a superior's right to use an inferior's body. The most famous same-sex relationship in Roman history stands as a poignant exception to the typical power dynamic: the deep, abiding love between the Emperor Hadrian and a beautiful Greek youth named Antinous. When Antinous tragically drowned in the Nile River, Hadrian's grief was so profound and so public that it defied all convention. The heartbroken emperor deified his lost lover, commissioning hundreds of statues of him that were spread across the empire and even founding a new city, Antinopolis, in his honor. This epic romance, immortalized in art, suggests that genuine affection could exist, a connection that seemed to transcend the usual cold calculus of dominance and submission. If male same-sex desire was openly integrated into the Roman power structure, female intimacy was almost entirely erased from it. Male Roman authors, who are our primary source of information, largely ignored relationships between women, dismissing them as irrelevant or harmless. When they did write about it, it was often with a tone of mockery or contempt. They used the derogatory Greek term tribas to describe a woman who took on the active, masculine, role in sex with another woman. This reveals their true anxiety. It wasn't the intimacy between women that they found threatening, but the idea of any woman daring to usurp the dominant role that they believed was naturally reserved for men. In the vast male-dominated canon of Roman literature, the surviving poems of Sulpicia shine as a precious and singular beacon. As a noblewoman writing in the 1st century BC, she provides one of the very few authentic female perspectives on love and desire that has come down to us. Her work is astonishingly candid, passionate, and free from the artifice that characterized much of the poetry written by her male contemporaries. In her verses, she speaks of love not as a game of conquest or submission, but as a mutual and sometimes painful experience. Her voice offers a vital, if fleeting, counter-narrative to the relentlessly masculine worldview that shaped Roman culture. Beyond the elite literature, the walls of cities like Pompeii give a voice to the women who were otherwise silent in the historical record. The graffiti scratched into stone by ordinary people reveals a world far more complex than the official image of the chaste, quiet matron. Here, women's voices emerge, raw, funny, romantic, and often just as vulgar as the men's. They declare their love for gladiators, insult rivals, and boast of their own desires. These anonymous inscriptions are a revolutionary source, proving that women were not just passive objects in the Roman sexual landscape, but were active, opinionated participants in the city's vibrant and messy social life. For some upper-class Roman women, the suffocating restrictions of their respectable lives led them to a bizarre and dangerous form of rebellion. There are accounts of matrons who would secretly register as prostitutes, not for money, but for the shocking degree of freedom the disguise afforded them. By adopting the persona of the most shamed women in society, they could escape the constant surveillance of their households. They could walk the streets unaccompanied, wear bright colors, and speak openly with men in a way that would have been unthinkable for a proper wife or daughter. It is a stunning paradox that in Rome, the path to autonomy for some women was through embracing a role of public shame. While official histories tell a story of power, conquest, and law, the quiet inscriptions on Roman tombstones tell a story of human connection. These epitaphs, carved in stone to commemorate the dead, often express a depth of personal affection that is absent from other sources. A grieving husband might call his deceased wife his sweetest soul, or parents might mourn a beloved child with heartbreaking sincerity. Even inscriptions for freed slaves as a liberty sometimes reveal relationships of deep loyalty and love that transcended their brutal origins. These funerary monuments provide a powerful glimpse into the private emotional bonds that gave meaning to Roman lives, a quiet counterpoint to the public theatre of dominance. While Roman women were barred from holding any formal political office, the private letters of statesmen like Cicero reveal the immense informal power they wielded behind the scenes. His correspondence with his wife Terentia and other elite women shows them not as passive figures, but as astute managers of vast family estates, central figures in complex social networks, and crucial negotiators of the marriage alliances that were the bedrock of Roman political life. These women were not secluded from the world of power. They were the indispensable, if unofficial, partners who managed the domestic and social machinery that allowed the men to govern. At the opposite end of the social spectrum, the life of a female slave was one of absolute and relentless vulnerability. Her existence was defined by a horrifying triple burden that served her master's interests. She was a source of labor, forced to perform grueling tasks within the household. She was a potential breeder, her reproductive capacity used to produce new slaves who would also be her master's property, and she was a perpetually available object for his sexual gratification. The law offered her no protection whatsoever from rape or abuse. Her body was not her own, but an instrument entirely subject to the whims and violence of the man who owned her. In the heart of every Roman city, the public bathhouse, or thermae, stood as a testament to the empire's genius for both engineering and social ritual. These were far more than mere places to cleanse the body. They were the vibrant, steaming epicenters of daily life. Within their sprawling complexes, a Roman could conduct business, negotiate political deals, exercise, read in the library, and catch up on the day's gossip. It was a uniquely democratic space where, for the price of a small coin, citizens of all classes, from powerful senators to humble plebeians, could mingle in a way that was impossible anywhere else. The bathhouse was not a luxury, but a cornerstone of Roman identity, a place where the life of the city was played out in all its noisy, naked glory. Stepping into the bathhouse meant stripping away the toga and the tunic, the visible markers of rank. Yet in a society so profoundly obsessed with status, nudity was never a true equalizer. It was simply a different kind of stage for the performance of power. A man's social standing was communicated through other means: the muscular, battle-scarred physique of a soldier, the flabby paunch of a wealthy merchant, the confident swagger of an aristocrat, or the number of slaves he had in attendance to oil his body and carry his towels. People watched one another with a critical eye, and the body itself became a text to be read, a testament to a man's history, discipline, and place in the unforgiving social hierarchy. While many bathhouses designated separate hours or sections for men and women, the practice of mixed bathing was surprisingly common, particularly in smaller towns or during festivals. This custom was a constant source of anxiety for conservative moralists, who saw it as a source of corruption and a threat to Roman virtue. Emperors like Hadrian attempted to regulate the practice by enforcing stricter schedules, but these decrees were often ignored or quietly lapsed over time. The persistent popularity of mixed bathing reveals a fundamental contradiction in Roman society, a culture that legally and socially preached female modesty but, in practice, embraced public spaces where those very rules were openly and eagerly flouted. The very atmosphere of the bathhouse, hot, steamy, and filled with naked bodies, made it a fertile ground for sexual opportunity. The condensation on the walls created a sense of anonymity and blurred social lines, encouraging a level of familiarity that would be unthinkable outside. It was an open secret that these establishments were hubs for both casual liaisons and commercial sex. Attendants, masseurs, and prostitutes would move through the crowds, offering their services. For many Romans, a trip to the baths was a multifaceted experience, a routine that could seamlessly blend public health, social networking, and private pleasure all under one vast, echoing roof. The Roman stage was another public space where the culture's obsession with sex was put on full display, not with solemnity, but with roaring laughter. The popular comedies, many adapted from the bawdy works of Greek playwrights, were built on plots of lust, infidelity, and elaborate deception. The audience, drawn from all walks of life, delighted in the misadventures of stock characters like the lecherous old man, the clever slave who facilitates his master's affairs, and the cunning prostitute. The humor was broad, physical, and laced with explicit double meanings, and actors would often mime sexual acts on stage to the thunderous applause of the crowd, revealing a society that loved its entertainment loud, lewd, and unapologetic. Perhaps no single work captures the playful cynicism of Roman sexual politics better than the poet Ovid's scandalous bestseller, Ars Amatorius, The Art of Love. This was not a collection of romantic sonnets, but a witty and deeply pragmatic how-to manual for the art of seduction. Ovid offered tactical advice on everything: where to find potential partners. He recommended the racetrack and the theatre, what compliments to use, and how to feign emotion to win a lover's trust. The work was so popular and so contrary to the moral reforms being pushed by Emperor Augustus that it ultimately contributed to Ovid's exile. His book was a testament to a society that treated love not as a mystery of the heart, but as a game of strategy and conquest. The world of flirtation and illicit affairs celebrated by Ovid stood in stark, brutal contrast to the reality of marriage for the Roman elite. For this class, marriage was rarely a matter of the heart. It was a cold, strategic transaction, a merger between two powerful families designed to consolidate wealth, forge political alliances, and, above all, produce legitimate heirs. A bride and groom might meet for the first time shortly before their wedding. Love was not a prerequisite, and emotional intimacy was not the goal. A husband and wife could live for decades under the same roof as virtual strangers, their lives running on separate tracks, their union bound by the iron chains of duty, property, and dynastic expectation. While a Roman husband was free to pursue pleasure with slaves, prostitutes, and concubines, his wife was trapped within a suffocating cage of moral expectations. Her entire worth and the honor of her family rested on her performance of virtue, or pudicitia. She was expected to be utterly loyal, perfectly obedient, and, most importantly, fertile, preferably with sons. Her life was one of constant scrutiny, where every glance, word, and action was judged against an impossible standard of perfection. This crushing double standard was not a subtle hypocrisy. It was the open and acknowledged foundation of a social order designed to ensure one thing: absolute male control over the family bloodline. For a Roman woman who dared to step outside this cage, the consequences were swift and merciless. An accusation of adultery, whether true or not, could lead to her complete ruin. At best, she would face a public divorce and social ostracism. At worst, the punishments were horrific. She could be stripped of her dowry, exiled to a barren island, or subjected to physical mutilation, such as having her nose cut off, a permanent and public mark of her shame that made her unmarriageable for life. This savage response reveals the core Roman belief that a woman's body was not her own, but the property of her male relatives, who could punish its misuse with impunity. The Roman appetite for spectacle often bled into its methods of punishment, creating a grotesque fusion of entertainment and cruelty that was deeply intertwined with sexual violence. In the arena, the execution of condemned criminals was sometimes transformed into a horrifying form of theatre. The authorities would stage elaborate reenactments of violent myths, forcing victims to play the roles of mythological characters who were raped by animals or mauled to death. For the cheering crowds, this was not just an execution, it was a live-action performance, a story brought to life where real suffering and sexual degradation were presented as part of the day's thrilling entertainment. While the state religion was largely a matter of public ritual and civic duty, the Roman Empire was also home to numerous mystery cults, many imported from the East, that operated in a darker, more ambiguous space. Within the secretive, torch-lit confines of these sects, the line between spiritual ecstasy and sexual exploitation could become dangerously blurred. A charismatic priest or priestess could use the language of divine union or sacred initiation as a pretext for coercing followers into sexual acts. They would claim the gods required such offerings, and within this framework of belief, abuse was easily reframed as a holy duty, protecting the perpetrators behind a veil of divine authority. The most famous example of this collision between religion and perceived debauchery was the Bacchanalian scandal of 186 BC. The rites of Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy, were originally small, women-only affairs but had evolved into huge secret nocturnal gatherings of both men and women. Rumors began to fly of frenzied drinking, wild sexual behavior, and even ritual murder. Terrified of a secret society operating beyond its control, the Roman Senate reacted with brutal force, launching a massive investigation that led to thousands of arrests and executions. The affair demonstrated the state's deep paranoia about any form of private association, especially one that mixed religious fervor with sexual license. The Roman talent for turning every aspect of life into a public spectacle reached a grotesque nadir in the form of sexual contests held in amphitheaters. These were not hidden, back-alley perversions but organized, ticketed events. Enslaved men and women, chosen for their physical attributes, were forced to perform sexual acts in front of thousands of spectators. The crowd would cheer, jeer, and place bets on which performer would demonstrate the most stamina, skill, or creativity. In this chilling monetization of human misery, the Roman elite found a way to transform private intimacy into a brutal spectator sport, with the participants' dignity being the ultimate price of admission. No figure better embodied the Roman obsession with sex and violence than the gladiator. He was at once a condemned criminal, a disposable slave, and a celebrated icon of masculine power, adored by the crowds for their skill and courage in the arena. The most famous gladiators became objects of intense sexual fantasy, particularly for some elite women. Their bodies, honed by brutal training and marked with scars, were seen as the pinnacle of virility. There are accounts of these men being rented out by their owners for lucrative private encounters, a transaction that perfectly captures their paradoxical status as both celebrated superstars and human property. This comfort with public sexuality was not confined to the arena, it extended right to the dinner table. It was entirely normal for a respectable Roman household to use pottery that was decorated with incredibly graphic erotic scenes. A guest at a banquet might be served wine from a jug, painted with a depiction of Pan chasing a nymph, or eat their meal from a plate featuring a series of different sexual positions. This was not considered pornography or poor taste. On the contrary, it was often seen as a mark of a witty, cultured, and sophisticated host. It spoke to a worldview where pleasure and art were inextricably linked, and where the human body in all its functions was a valid subject for everyday decoration. In the most decadent and powerful households of the empire, the absolute power of a master over his slave was demonstrated in the most horrific way imaginable. There are accounts from Roman satirists and philosophers describing an elite practice of using a slave, male or female, for a single night of sexual entertainment, only to have them unceremoniously killed the following morning. In the cold calculus of Roman law, this was not a crime. A slave was property, and an owner had the absolute legal right to destroy his property for any reason, or for no reason at all. It was the ultimate, chilling expression of dominance, an act that treated a human life as a disposable consumer good. The horror of this act was often compounded by what came after. The disposal of the slave's body was frequently not done with discretion, but with a theatrical flourish designed to advertise the master's power. The corpse might be dumped at a public crossroads, left near a fountain, or simply tossed into an alley where it could be seen by passers-by. This was not mere negligence, it was a deliberate and calculated message. It was a grotesque demonstration to the entire community that the master's power was so absolute, so far beyond the reach of law or morality, that he could not only take a life, but could also treat the remains with utter contempt, turning the very act of disposal into a final performance of his dominance. The fall of Rome did not extinguish its complex legacy of sexuality, it merely buried it for a time. When the artists, scholars, and nobles of the Renaissance began to look back to the classical world for inspiration, they rediscovered not only its art, architecture, and philosophy, but also its frank and permissive eroticism. They eagerly collected ancient Roman sculptures of nudes, translated the bawdy verses of poets like Ovid and Catullus, and were inspired by the open celebration of the human body. This rediscovery led to a new, if often more private, embrace of sensual pleasure among the European elite, proving that Rome's influence extended far beyond the battlefield and the Senate, reaching deep into the bedrooms of history. Beyond any specific artwork or custom, the most profound and persistent legacy of Roman sexuality is the underlying mindset that sex is, and always has been, an expression of hierarchy. The Roman worldview was built on the fundamental assumption that a person's status in society dictated their rights and roles in any sexual encounter. The right of the powerful to take and the obligation of the powerless to be taken was the central unspoken rule. This toxic but incredibly resilient idea that sex is a transaction of power rather than a union of equals has echoed through Western civilization for centuries, continuing to shape attitudes about masculinity, consent, and control. Our entire portrait of Roman sexuality is a composition painted almost exclusively by, and for a tiny fraction of its population, the literate, wealthy, freeborn men. Their poems, their histories, and their letters are the sources we must rely on. As a result, the actual experiences of the vast majority of people are lost in a profound and tragic silence. What did the enslaved girl in the brothel feel? What did the boy servant in the villa dream of? What were the private griefs and joys of the ordinary provincial wife? We can only guess. Their bodies are visible everywhere in the art and literature, but their voices are gone, leaving a haunting void at the very center of the story. For the men at the pinnacle of the Roman world, particularly the emperors, absolute power did not just corrupt, it granted a chilling license for perversion. Wealth and status created a protective shield of impunity, a space where the normal strictures of law, morality, and even basic human decency no longer applied. Within the walls of the imperial palace, the most twisted fantasies could be enacted without consequence. In a strange inversion of values, these acts of depravity were not always seen as disqualifying flaws. Sometimes they were interpreted as a confirmation of a man's god-like status, a terrifying demonstration that he was a being who stood far above the petty rules that governed ordinary mortals. What modern eyes might view as grotesque or shocking was often woven into the very fabric of Roman daily life, completely normalized by custom and belief. The culture was saturated with images and objects that fused the sexual with the sacred and the protective. Amulets shaped like male genitals, the fascinum, were worn by soldiers and children alike to ward off evil. Garden statues of the god Priapus were depicted with cartoonishly large erections to symbolize fertility, and public baths and private homes were filled with murals depicting group sex or domination. This wasn't a hidden, shameful subculture. It was the mainstream, visible expression of a society that saw raw, potent sexual energy as a vital and even magical force in the world. The chronicles of the Roman Empire are stained with allegations of cruelty so extreme they defy belief, and nowhere is this more apparent than in the accounts of bestiality as a form of imperial entertainment. Historians described how emperors like Nero, in their quest for novel and shocking spectacles, would stage events that blurred the lines between human and animal. These were not just crude rumors, they were stories recorded by Roman writers themselves, detailing theatrical performances where condemned criminals or slaves were tied to stakes and attacked, sometimes by people dressed as animals, and in some interpretations, by actual beasts. This was the ultimate expression of a ruler's power, the ability to command not just his subjects, but nature itself, in a depraved performance of domination. The archaeological evidence from cities like Pompeii suggests that the Roman exploration of sexual desire extended into dedicated, physical spaces designed for taboo tastes. Imagine a wealthy aristocrat, after a long dinner, leading his most trusted guests not to a library, but to a private room, its walls decorated with meticulously painted frescoes of bondage, domination, or other scenes that we might now categorize as BDSM. These were not hidden corners of shame, but proudly displayed galleries of the host's refined and adventurous appetites. Guests would be expected to admire the artistry, laugh at the audacity, and perhaps even participate in a world where one's sexual curiosity was a mark of sophistication. Amidst this culture of celebrated indulgence, there were voices that argued for restraint, most notably the Stoic philosophers. Seneca the Younger, who had the unenviable task of being a tutor and advisor to the young Emperor Nero, wrote passionately about the virtues of temperance, self-control, and reason. He warned that a man who could not master his own desires was unfit to master an empire. But his philosophical pleas for moderation were like a whisper in a hurricane. In the imperial court, where applause was reserved for the most extravagant displays of appetite, Seneca's ideals were largely ignored, his life a tragic testament to the powerlessness of reason in the face of absolute, corrupting power. In the Roman legal system, punishment was not merely about inflicting pain or enacting justice, it was a form of political theatre designed to demonstrate the absolute power of the state. One of the most potent tools in this theatre was sexual humiliation. To be stripped naked in public was to be stripped of one's dignity and social standing. The state would weaponize this shame, often forcing condemned criminals to be paraded through the streets naked before their execution. In some of the more grotesque spectacles in the arena, sexual assault was incorporated into the punishment itself, transforming the act of justice into a public display of degradation that reinforced the state's ultimate ownership over the individual body. For the enslaved population of Rome, life was an existence defined by a horrifying dual vulnerability. They were trapped between two forms of their master's absolute power, with no legal recourse against either. They could not refuse a sexual demand, as their bodies were considered the legal property of their owner, to be used for his pleasure at any moment. At the same time, they could not refuse death. If a master grew tired of them, became angry, or simply wished to demonstrate his power, he could have them killed with the same impunity. This constant, inescapable threat of either sexual violation or arbitrary execution created a psychological prison from which there was no escape. What made this existence even more terrifying was the profound inconsistency of the master's behavior. A slave's life was not governed by a clear set of rules, but by the unpredictable, shifting whims of their owner. An act that earned a reward of better food or softer clothing one day could result in a brutal beating the next. This deliberate unpredictability was a powerful instrument of psychological control. By ensuring that the enslaved could never feel safe or secure and never knew what to expect, masters maintained a state of constant fear and anxiety, effectively crushing the will to resist and enforcing a total, debilitating dependence. The loud, aggressive, and often brutal performance of masculinity that characterized Roman culture was not a sign of confidence, but of a deep and pervasive paranoia. The entire social structure was built on a man's reputation, and that reputation was constantly under threat. The fear of being perceived as weak, effeminate, or submissive was the central anxiety of the Roman male identity. This is why they turned every aspect of their lives, especially sex, into a public theatre of dominance. Their obsession with image was a defense mechanism, a desperate attempt to project an aura of unwavering control in a world where a single whisper could lead to utter ruin. The Roman Empire remains a study in spectacular contradictions. This was a civilization that mastered logic, discipline, and engineering on an unprecedented scale, building roads, aqueducts, and legal systems that would endure for a millennium. Yet, this same culture of order and reason simultaneously embraced the most chaotic, unrestrained, and indulgent forms of human behavior. This wasn't necessarily hypocrisy, it was two sides of the same imperial coin. The obsessive drive to control the external world, to tame rivers, conquer enemies, and codify laws was perfectly matched by an equally obsessive drive to command the internal world of desire, pleasure, and the human body. Perhaps nowhere is the Roman worldview more perfectly preserved than in the cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum. which were frozen in time by the ash of Mount Vesuvius. These ruins are more than just an archaeological wonder. They are a time capsule of a society's relationship with sex. Walking through these silent streets, one finds the casual, unapologetic evidence of desire everywhere, in the explicit frescoes left uncovered above marital beds, in the erotic mosaics on dining room floors, and in the phallic good luck charms carved into the walls of bakeries. Pompeii offers an unfiltered record of a culture that did not hide its passions, but integrated them into the very architecture of its daily life. While 2 millennia separate our world from theirs, the echoes of Roman sexual attitudes and practices are surprisingly persistent in modern life. Our contemporary obsession with curating a perfect public image and the career-destroying potential of a single private scandal is a direct descendant of the Roman obsession with reputation. Furthermore, many sexual explorations that might seem uniquely modern, from exhibitionism and role-playing to the use of sex toys and the dynamics of BDSM, all have clear antecedents in the rituals, private lives, and even the sex manuals of the ancient Romans. It seems that for all our technological advancement, our core desires and anxieties have changed very little. Beyond any specific custom, the most disturbing and enduring Roman legacy is the brutal calculation of power that governed their sexual ethics. The fundamental idea that a person of high status possesses an inherent right to the body and desire of a person of lower status has proven to be a tragically resilient concept. Throughout Western history, this logic has resurfaced again and again, sometimes disguised as the divine right of kings, sometimes as the prerogative of a master, and sometimes simply as the unspoken privilege of wealth and influence. The Roman belief that sex is a legitimate tool for enforcing hierarchy remains a dark and powerful undercurrent in the modern world. It is crucial, however, to avoid painting the entire Roman Empire with a single, lurid brushstroke. To imagine it as one monolithic, 1,000-year-long orgy is to fall for a caricature. The reality was far more complex and filled with contradictions. It was a society that evolved over time, with periods of profound decadence followed by eras of stern moral reform. Emperors like Augustus passed strict laws to curb adultery, even exiling his own daughter for her promiscuity, while others, like Caligula Nero, reveled in public depravity. Roman society was a constant battleground of competing values, and its sexuality was as varied and conflicted as the people themselves. For the modern visitor, a walk through Pompeii can be a deeply uncomfortable experience because it holds up a mirror to our own society. We are confronted with a culture that was completely open about the very things we tend to privatize and pathologize. The casual nudity of the baths, the explicit art in family homes, and the vulgar graffiti on public walls can be jarring because they challenge our own carefully constructed boundaries between public and private, art and obscenity, shame and celebration. The discomfort we feel is perhaps a recognition that the Romans were not necessarily more perverse than we are. They were simply more honest about the messy, complicated, and powerful role that sex plays in human life. Ultimately, the story of Roman sexuality is the story of power. For the Romans, sex was never allowed to be a simple, private act of pleasure between equals. It was a currency to be spent, a language to be spoken, and a weapon to be wielded. It was used to seal political alliances through marriage, to destroy the reputations of rivals through slander, to enforce the brutal hierarchy of master and slave, and to perform one's own masculinity for the entire world to see. In the grand theatre of Roman life, every sexual act had an audience, and the stakes were nothing less than one's honor, one's status, and one's very place in the world. Empires do not just fall because of invading armies at the gates, sometimes they rot from within. While it would be too simplistic to claim that sexual decadence caused the fall of Rome, the culture of excess was undoubtedly a symptom of a deeper imperial arrogance. The same hubris that allowed the Romans to believe they could conquer any territory and enslave any people also led them to believe that human bodies could be used, broken, and discarded without consequence. This profound lack of empathy, This belief that no pleasure was too costly as long as it affirmed power revealed the moral and spiritual weaknesses that would eventually make the empire too brittle to survive. Today, you can witness the vast gulf between our world and theirs in the reactions of tourists walking through the ruins of Pompeii. They stand before the crumbling walls of ancient brothels and gaze at faded paintings of gods and mortals in sexual embrace. There is often a nervous laugh, a hushed whisper, or an averted glance from a parent to a child. Some snap photos of the ceramic penises on kitchen walls with a sense of ironic amusement. This modern cocktail of fascination and discomfort is a testament to the bluntness of what the Romans left behind. They did not hide their desires in the shadows, they carved them into stone, leaving a record so honest it still has the power to make us blush. As we conclude this journey into the most intimate corners of Roman life, it becomes clear that their story is not just one of historical shock value. It is a timeless and deeply human drama. The ancient Romans wrestled with the same potent forces that shape our lives today: the intoxicating lure of power, the crushing weight of public image, the desperate need for control, and the corrosive nature of shame. They were not a different species of human, more depraved or perverse than ourselves. They were simply more open and theatrical about the brutal, beautiful, and often terrifying ways in which human desire and social dominance are forever intertwined. So, as we leave the dust and echoes of the ancient world behind, take a moment to reflect. The customs may have changed, the gods may have different names, and the empire may be long gone, but the questions the Romans forced upon themselves remain. Their story is a powerful reminder of the delicate balance between civilization and our most primal instincts. May your sleep be peaceful, and your dreams, perhaps, be free of the steam and whispers of Roman bathhouses. Good night, friend.